Silver Creek was the kind of town where nothing much happened. Nestled in the woods, it was known for its quiet streets and friendly neighbors. But in recent weeks, a strange event had disturbed the town's peaceful reputation. It started when people noticed a large black shepherd dog lingering by a grave deep in the forest. No one could explain why the dog was there or why it never seemed to leave. The grave itself was unremarkable, just a mound of earth with no headstone or marker to identify who rested beneath. But the dog, with its sleek black fur and piercing amber eyes, sat there day after day, night after night, guarding it as if it were protecting something. Locals tried to approach the dog out of curiosity, but each time someone came too close, it would growl or snap at them, fiercely defending its spot. Word of the mysterious dog spread, and soon rumors began to fly. Some said the dog had belonged to the person buried there, though no one could recall any recent burials in the area. Others whispered that the grave was cursed and that the dog was a sentinel, keeping something evil from escaping. No one knew what to believe, but as the dog's presence grew harder to ignore, the local authorities were eventually called in. Officer Jenkins and his partner, Officer Daniels, were dispatched to investigate. They expected to find nothing more than a stray, perhaps a dog that had lost its owner and was mourning. But when they arrived at the grave, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary situation. As Jenkins and Daniels approached the grave, they immediately noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds chirped, no wind rustled through the trees, just an eerie, heavy silence that seemed to press down on them. The only sound was the soft growling of the black shepherd as it watched their every move. The dog's amber eyes seemed almost human in their intensity, filled with a strange mix of warning and desperation. Jenkins knelt by the grave, feeling the disturbed earth beneath his fingers. "Looks like someone's been digging," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The soil was loose, as if it had been recently moved. Daniels glanced at him, unimpressed. "It's just an old grave. Maybe the dog's been digging it up," he suggested, though there was a tension in his voice that betrayed his unease. Suddenly, the dog let out a long, mournful bark that echoed through the forest. It stood up, pacing anxiously around the grave, its gaze never leaving Jenkins and Daniels. Something about the dog's behavior unsettled them both, though neither wanted to admit it. "We should check this out," Jenkins said, more to himself than to Daniels. His partner sighed, clearly reluctant, but nodded in agreement. The officers began making calls, arranging for a forensic team to come out and investigate. As they waited, the dog continued its frantic pacing, occasionally barking at the ground as if urging them to hurry. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were about to uncover wasn't something they were prepared for. By the time the forensic team arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The dog's anxious behavior had only intensified, its barking becoming more desperate as the officers and the forensic team gathered around the grave. Jenkins stood off to the side, watching as the team began to carefully remove the loose soil. The deeper they dug, the more the air around them seemed to change. What had been a mild autumn afternoon was now unnaturally cold, with a biting chill that made Jenkins pull his jacket tighter around himself. The wind had picked up, but instead of rustling the leaves or moving the branches, it seemed to howl through the trees in strange, hollow gusts. One of the forensic workers suddenly froze, his shovel striking something hard. "I've got something," he called out, his voice tinged with unease. Everyone gathered around as the team brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing the corner of an old wooden box buried beneath the surface. The wood was rotting, and a foul stench began to rise from the ground, making several of the officers gag. Jenkins felt his stomach twist in knots as he looked at the box. It was too small to be a proper coffin, but something about it made his skin crawl. The dog, now barking uncontrollably, tried to get closer to the box, clawing at the dirt. One of the forensic team members, visibly shaken, hesitated. "Should we open it?" Jenkins wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever was inside wasn't meant to be found. The forensic team decided to proceed, despite the growing sense of dread that hung over the group. Jenkins stood by, his eyes never leaving the dog, which now seemed frantic, pacing, barking, and clawing at the earth as though trying to warn them. His partner, Daniels, remained skeptical. "It's just a box, probably some old junk," he muttered. though his voice lacked its usual confidence. As one of the forensic workers prepared to pry open the box, a strange feeling settled over the group. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, pressing down on their chests and making it hard to breathe. Jenkins wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, even though the air was growing colder by the second. The worker wedged a crowbar under the lid of the box and with a loud creak pried it open. Immediately, a foul odor filled the air, far worse than before. Several people stepped back, covering their noses, while the dog let out a high-pitched whine, its tail tucked between its legs. Inside the box was a collection of strange, tattered objects. An old, faded photograph of a family, a set of decaying clothes, and something else. Something that defied explanation. At first glance, it looked like a small, mummified hand, but it was too disfigured, too unnatural. Jenkins felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with such force that it nearly knocked them off their feet. The dog, now silent, sat down by the grave once more, staring at them with an intensity that chilled Jenkins to the bone. Something terrible had been uncovered, and they had only begun to scratch the surface. Jenkins couldn't tear his eyes away from the contents of the box. The photograph, yellowed with age, showed a family of four, a man, a woman, and two young children. The family seemed normal at first glance, but the longer Jenkins looked, the more disturbing the image became. Their eyes were wide and vacant, their expressions frozen in a strange, unnatural way. He could feel something wrong radiating from the picture, a deep unease that made him want to look away, but he couldn't. Daniel, standing beside him, cleared his throat, clearly trying to shake off the unsettling atmosphere. "Just some old junk. We should get this back to the station and figure out where it came from," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He too seemed disturbed by what they had found. One of the forensic team members gingerly lifted the photograph and placed it in an evidence bag. But as they did, the wind picked up again, swirling around them like a cyclone. The leaves on the ground spun in tight circles, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. Jenkins felt a tightness in his chest, like the very forest was closing in on them. The dog, which had been watching silently, suddenly stood and began barking again, this time more aggressively, as if it was trying to stop them from taking the evidence. Jenkins took a step back, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never believed in the supernatural, but at that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond their understanding was happening, and they had just awakened it. The moment the box was opened, the atmosphere around the grave shifted from eerie to downright terrifying. A palpable chill ran through the group as they stared at the contents of the box. The photograph and the strange objects inside seemed innocent enough on the surface, but there was something deeply unsettling about them, as though they carried a dark history that no one could explain. Jenkins felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get as far away from the grave as possible, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. The dog, now sitting completely still, stared at them with an almost human intensity. Its amber eyes seemed to say, "I warned you." The silence was broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional bark from the dog. Suddenly, Jenkins noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a movement just beyond the edge of the clearing. He turned his head sharply, but whatever it was had vanished. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it just his imagination? Or was something or someone watching them from the shadows? Daniel, standing beside him, seemed equally shaken. He was usually the more skeptical of the two, but now his face was pale and his hands trembled slightly. "Let's just get this stuff back to the station," he muttered, clearly eager to leave. But as they began to gather the items from the box, a cold, unnatural presence seemed to settle over the group. It was as if something had awakened, a force that had been disturbed from its slumber, and it wasn't happy. As the officers packed up the strange items from the grave, an unsettling quiet blanketed the woods. The dog, now completely still, watched them with an intensity that made Jenkins' skin crawl. The weight of the strange presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. He felt as if they were being watched, not just by the dog, but by something unseen lurking in the dark corners of the forest. Jenkins couldn't shake the sense that opening the grave had disturbed something ancient, something that should have remained hidden. His thoughts were interrupted when Daniels cursed under his breath. "Jenkins, look at this." He held up the photograph, which had been placed inside an evidence bag. The figures in the photo, the family of four, seemed to have changed. Their eyes, once blank and vacant, now looked directly at the camera. Their expressions had twisted into grotesque smiles, their faces distorted with unnatural glee. Jenkins' stomach turned as he realized that the photograph had somehow altered itself. It was impossible. Photos didn't just change on their own, but there it was, undeniable and horrifying. The dog let out a low growl, its eyes focused on the photograph as if it, too, understood the gravity of the situation. "What the hell is going on?" Daniels whispered, his voice trembling. The cold air seemed to close in on them, the forest growing darker with each passing second. Jenkins didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they needed to leave. But as they turned to go, the wind picked up again, stronger this time, and a whisper, soft and sinister, seemed to float through the air, chilling them to the bone. It was a voice, distant yet distinct, that said one word: "Stay." The officers quickened their pace as they made their way back to their car, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them. What should have been a short walk back to the road felt as if it were taking forever. The trees loomed larger, the shadows between them growing darker, and every rustle in the underbrush sounded like something or someone following them. Jenkins kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dog trailing them, or worse, the strange figures from the photograph stepping out from the trees. Daniels, usually the more composed of the two, was visibly shaken. "This isn't right, Jenkins. The woods. It feels like we're being watched." His voice, barely above a whisper, was tinged with fear. Jenkins nodded. He felt it too. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to be growing stronger the farther they got from the grave. The wind had picked up again, swirling around them in an almost deliberate pattern, making it hard to move forward. And then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, Jenkins saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was too fast to get a good look, but it was there, darting just out of sight. Jenkins froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Daniels didn't answer, but his wide-eyed expression told Jenkins that he had seen it too. They stood there, hearts pounding, trying to convince themselves it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, Jenkins knew better. Something was following them, something that didn't want them to leave. And as they finally reached their car and sped away, Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. Something had been set free, and it was coming for them. Back at the station, Jenkins and Daniels tried to make sense of what had happened in the woods, but the more they talked, the more surreal it all seemed. The photograph, still in its evidence bag, sat on Jenkins' desk, its eerie new details haunting him. The figures' grotesque smiles were burned into his mind, and every time he glanced at the photo, he swore their eyes followed him. "I don't know what to make of this," Jenkins said, his voice shaky. "We need to report it, but who's going to believe us? A dog guarding a grave, a changing photograph? It sounds insane." Daniels rubbed his temples, clearly rattled. "Maybe we don't report it. Not yet. Let's figure out what's really going on before we bring anyone else into this." His voice, though firm, wavered with doubt. He was as scared as Jenkins was, but neither of them wanted to admit it. As the night wore on, strange things began happening around the station. Lights flickered, radios crackled with static, and a cold draft seemed to sweep through the building, though no windows or doors were open. Jenkins tried to focus on his paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to the grave and the unsettling events that followed. Just after midnight, Jenkins heard it, faint at first but unmistakable. A soft, growling sound, low and menacing, coming from somewhere inside the station. He stood up, heart racing, and followed the sound down the hallway. As he turned the corner, he froze. The black shepherd dog was sitting in the middle of the hallway, its amber eyes glowing in the dim light. It wasn't growling, just staring, unmoving. Jenkins felt his blood turn to ice. How had the dog gotten inside? What did it want? And why was it here in the station? Jenkins blinked, convinced that he was seeing things. The dog couldn't be here. It was impossible. But there it was, sitting calmly in the hallway, its eyes fixed on him. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, it simply watched. Jenkins called out to Daniels, his voice barely steady. "Daniels, you need to see this!" Moments later, Daniels rushed down the hallway, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw the dog. His face went pale. "What the? How did it get in here?" Jenkins shook his head. "I don't know, but it's the same dog, the one from the grave." As they stood there staring at the dog, a realization struck Jenkins. There was something almost intelligent about the way it was looking at them. It wasn't just an animal. It felt like it understood more than it should. The same oppressive presence they had felt in the woods began to creep over them again, filling the station with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the station into darkness. Jenkins' breath hitched as he fumbled for his flashlight. The dog remained in the same spot, its eyes glowing eerily in the dark. When the lights flickered back on a few seconds later, the dog was gone. Jenkins and Daniels exchanged terrified glances. The dog hadn't left through any doors or windows. It had simply vanished, as if it had never been there. The events of the past day had spiraled far beyond anything they could comprehend. Something dark had been unleashed, and Jenkins knew, deep in his bones, that it wasn't finished with them yet.